And this is the Q&A podcast, and I'm your host, Peter Slen. Thanks for joining us. Well, what is 2,340 miles long and borders 10 states? We find out shortly with author Boyce Upholt. 2,340 miles long, bordering 10 states, the Mississippi River has 192 bridge crossings and runs from Minnesota to Louisiana. Connecticut native Boyce Upholt became fascinated with the Mississippi River in his childhood after reading Mark Twain's accounts of it in Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. Now a resident of New Orleans, Mr. Upholt looks back at the history and current state of the Mississippi River in his new book, The Great River. Our conversation begins now. Boyce Upholt is the author of this book, The Great River, The Making and Unmaking of the Mississippi. Mr. Upholt, you grew up in suburban Connecticut. What's your fascination with the Mississippi River?
I did grow up in suburban Connecticut. I will note that I grew up going on field trips to Mark Twain's house, so maybe that embedded itself in me somehow. But really, the origins of this book, this project, came 10 years ago this year. I had been living in rural Mississippi for a while. I was sort of a footloose young man after college trying to figure out how to be a writer, and had landed a job with a nonprofit in Mississippi. Started doing a little bit of writing there, and one of my early assignments was about a canoe guide named John Ruskey, who is sort of the canoe guide if you want to go on the Mississippi River in the South, which back then I thought was an odd sort of thing to do. I thought the Mississippi was just this big canal for big boats, probably pretty toxic and ugly and brutal, but, it would be fun to go out there for a couple of days nonetheless. So I took on this assignment about John and spent 3 days and 2 nights canoeing with him on the Mississippi, and actually a little bit on the Atchafalaya River, and was blown away by that trip, by John himself, but by the river itself. It was so much more beautiful than anyone had sort of led me to believe, and found myself I was living 15 miles from the river, and here was this giant wilderness space in my backyard that suddenly I wanted to spend as much time in as I could. And so it just became an obsession that eventually, after 8 years, grew into this book.
How much of the 2,340 miles of the Mississippi have you traveled?
By canoe, I've traveled about 1,100. So I've gone from St. Louis all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, along with some little stretches and other pieces. So I've done a little bit up near the headwaters. I've been in Minneapolis. I've actually done a tiny bit on the Missouri River. But I've driven in a car for most of the rest of those 1,000 miles that I didn't hit by canoe. Of course, in car, you don't always get as close to the water, but I've sort of explored the landscape alongside the river as well as the water itself.
Can you get in a canoe at Lake Itasca in Minnesota and canoe all the way straight down to the Gulf of Mexico?
Yes and no. Many people do get in a canoe in Lake Itasca and come down. I know several people doing that right now. I think it's around 50 a year wind up making that trip. The big obstacle is you have to get past a number of locks and dams. And so in Minneapolis in particular, there is one lock that is no longer in operation. So technically you'd have to get out there and walk around it. A lot of people, I know people that have walked around all the locks as sort of a form of protest, feeling like they have mangled this river. But it is not quite as popular as the Appalachian Trail, but a number of people do tackle that adventure every year.
Well, here are some facts about the Mississippi River. It is 2,340 miles long. That's the second longest in the U.S. It travels from Minnesota to Louisiana, bordering 10 states. 32 states are in its watershed. There are 142 bridges across the Mississippi, and 29 dams are on the Mississippi as well. What's one of the best experiences you ever had on the river?
Oh, I mean, it's the sort of 6 weeks that I got to spend canoeing. There were some harrowing experiences where there's some trees blowing over in our camps, but day to day it was just wonderful. I'm trying to think of what sticks out as the very best. I mean, it was really just every night landing on these islands and sandbars that are on the Mississippi River. You could be quite close to Memphis or New Orleans or other St. Louis and be in this sort of wild feeling space. And so to me, it was just the day to day of getting up every morning and watching the sunrise, landing the canoe every night, watching the sunset, and realizing, what this place looks like and how many, that it's been overlooked and no one realizes quite what we have of the Mississippi River.
What about on the other side of that equation? What are some of the worst experiences you had?
Well, I mentioned these trees coming down, particularly hackberry trees, seem not very well rooted. So this was back in 2017 was when I did this log trip, and it was a really windy spring, and so 3 or 4 times trees blew down into our camps. At one point, a tree landed on an occupied tent. Fortunately, sort of just missed the woman who was sleeping inside, but that wow led us to pause the trip for quite a while. I think the other harrowing experience is I said at the beginning, I had the sense that the Mississippi River was just a canal for big boats, and it definitely is a highway for big boats. And so avoiding those boats is part of the experience too. I wound up in 2019, there was a record-setting flood, and with John Ruskey, the guide I mentioned earlier, he loves to see the river in all of its stages. So we decided to kind of surf the flood crest down here in Louisiana and launched in Baton Rouge, came down into New Orleans, and this is the most heavily tracked part of the river where I live now in New Orleans. And there were some boats, the waves that were being thrown off by the boats because of how much water was in the river, and they were frustrated that we were out there kind of in their way. And then that was a pretty scary afternoon. We got off the river pretty quick and realized that that was a foolhardy adventure that we had embarked on.
Do you run into wildlife on the river?
Oh yeah, tons of wildlife. I have not yet seen a bear. Bears are making a comeback down here in the South, but sort of coyotes are kind of a dime a dozen. You don't see them, but you'll often hear them at night. Beavers are the really common thing. Deer, and of course, tons and tons of birds. The Mississippi is this flyway essentially, right? It provides this network of waterways for birds that are heading north to Canada. And so I remember, as we were coming down the river that spring, the least interior tern is a formerly endangered species that, because of some restoration activities along the Mississippi and its tributaries, has really managed to come back. And we were able to see sort of the northward migration of those tern that year, one of the first years after it was taken off the endangered species list. So really cool to get to see that again, this thing that people don't think of about the Mississippi River, the fact that it is this ecosystem, this wild space.
Boyce Upholt, how fast is the current?
It depends on the day, depends on the flooding. I think 2 or 3 miles an hour would be a pretty normal rate. But again, when the river's flooding, it can get up, 8 miles an hour, 10 miles an hour, and that can be. It doesn't sound that fast, but that can lead to some dangers when you see all that water piling up against obstacles downstream.
And it's all flowing south, correct? The current?
Yes, I mean the river heads south there. It is a very windy river, especially the lower Mississippi River. So the lower river is where the Ohio, the Missouri, the Mississippi have all wound together and become this just monstrous river down here in the southern U.S. And all of that water traveling through a pretty flat river-built landscape leads to the river meandering. And so there'll be places where you are making this big loop that's 20 miles long. And so you've gone 20 miles by river to make a distance of maybe a mile if you went as the crow flies. And so through those loops, you are sometimes going directly north, even for a couple miles at a time. So it's sort of, yeah, geologically tangled that way.
Can you estimate the economic impact of the Mississippi River?
I would hesitate to give numbers just because it is so large and so complex. I mean, the freight traffic on the river is in the millions, if not billions of dollars a year, right? It is a really essential conduit, particularly for grain farmers in the upper Midwest and other places. This is how the corn that is grown in the Dakotas, in Minnesota, that's how it gets down to New Orleans and then is shipped abroad because a lot of what those farmers are growing winds up going for export. I include the Ohio and the Missouri as parts of what make the Mississippi what it is, and so there's quite a lot of petrochemical and fossil fuel movement on the Ohio River. That's sort of a hot spot for that. And then it's just right when you think about the way it's intertwined with the ports here in Louisiana, which just so many things come in and out. I mean, it is a forgotten piece, an overlooked piece often, but it really is essential to the modern American economy, the goods that move on the river.
Boyce Upholt, for those of us who have been at Lake Itasca and walked across the Mississippi, is that an accurate starting point of the river?
It's an excellent question. I found myself reluctant to visit Itasca when I first started working on this project because I came to know the river first in Mississippi and Louisiana, and so I consider my home river this lower Mississippi River, what I was describing before, this giant big river that pulls so much together. And to me, again, that is the essence. The title of the book, The Great River, has to do with just how big that watershed is, and that the water is coming from New York and it's coming from Montana and from Saskatchewan. And so that name Itasca, it sounds indigenous, but it's not. It is sort of this construction by a white explorer who decided this is where it begins, and it's sort of jamming together some Latin words for true head. And to me, that's an oversimplification. Even this quest to find the single headwaters of any given river reduces what a river is, right? A river is more than just a line on a map, this single blue line. It pulls together all these tributaries. It has floodplains that it connects with sometimes. And so I think we should think of the Mississippi River as having infinite headwaters. Anywhere the rain is falling on more than 1 million square miles of the US, that's a headwaters of the Mississippi River. But I will say, I mean, what I love about Itasca when I went there, I was really moved by seeing people that had come so far. It's a very distant place from any city or settled place, and people were making this pilgrimage to go and walk across that tiny little waterway. And that was really moving to me. I just came away saying, like, we should consider so many other places in this watershed the sacred and think about them as precious beginning points as well.
But it was the Minnesota legislature, you write, that declared Itasca as a starting point.
It was, but even there, it sort of is like there. It depends on what you mean by starting point, right? Often, the standard metric is you take the longer river, and that would actually lead you up the Missouri River. And there is sort of some hand waving in the legislation and reports that said, yeah, that's how we typically do this. But people have always considered the Mississippi to be the real source and not the Missouri. And there's not that much evidence of that. I think indigenous people thousands of years ago didn't really care about the entire length of a river. They got to know their local stretches of river. And so there were some false claims there. And even if you decide the Mississippi River is the one that matters, there are even smaller creeks that pour into Lake Itasca, even smaller lakes. And it was sort of like, well, this is we can build a state park around this singular lake rather than having to say, here's 4 or 5 tiny little lakes. So yeah, those beginning points there's sort of some politics, some money, some arbitrary decisions as we try and package the river into something presentable to people.
What is it like when the Missouri and the Mississippi meet, and the same at the confluence of the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers?
Yeah, I mean, when big rivers come together, you get big water, right? And so you can see, right, the Missouri is the source of a lot of the sediment. The Ohio River is the source of actually a lot of the water. And so the one that's most striking, I think, was where the Ohio and the Mississippi come together, because the Mississippi and the Missouri have brought in all this dirt from the Great Plains from up north, and the Ohio is just dumping in this water. So all of a sudden, the river becomes huge down there at the confluence of the Ohio and the Mississippi. It's as much as a mile wide, and you're just like confronted by this vast river, surrounded by this vast floodplain, this flat valley. But also, like if you're paying attention, if you're sort of overhead a little bit, you can really see the bluish greenish waters of the Ohio and the brownish waters of the Mississippi. It takes them a while to blend together, so you can see these two different sort of tongues of water slowly making their way into one river together for a few miles downstream.
You write in the book, The Great River, that the Mississippi never sticks to its banks. What do you mean?
Yeah, I mean, it's something we've learned again and again and again. A river this big really can't be contained. So I mentioned it a little bit earlier, all those bending and twisting of the river down here in the south, and that's a part of it, right? Historically, the Mississippi would carve these big bends. It's basically, trying to make gravity's pulling the water south, but it's not going to make a direct line because there's not enough slope there. And there's a lot of like physics and hydraulics involved. But when you're going around a big bend, the water on the outside of that bend has to move faster to keep up with the water on the inside of the bend. They have to sort of reach the same point, but it goes farther on the outside. That faster water actually causes erosion. The slower water on the inside of the bend isn't eroding. It's actually sort of depositing some of the sediment in the river because the river's moving slower. It can't hold it anymore. And those actions make that bend get bigger and bigger, wider and wider and wider. Eventually it gets so wide, it takes on this like horseshoe shape that in a flood, it will just kind of punch through the horseshoe and make a jump. And so you get what are called oxbow lakes along the river, these curls of water that are no longer connected or only connected to the river when it's in flood stage. So that's one thing I mean. Then just floods, right? When you have water from across 1 million square miles coming together, when there's snow melt, when there's big storms, the river goes up and down. And so it's not easy to demarcate quite exactly where the river stops and where the floodplain begins. And so I came to, in studying the history of the river and what we've done to it, I realized one of the mistakes that has been made over the past couple of centuries is trying to define the river as sort of this line of water that stays in its banks. So we made it our mission to trying to get it to stay in our banks. It just seems like a fruitless mission to me when you're dealing with something as geologically monstrous as this Mississippi River.
At its widest, how wide?
Ooh, that's a good question. There's so many numbers I lose the trivia. Again, I think of to me, I think of that mile wide-ish stretch where they come together. I think it's even wider up in Minnesota. There's a few natural lakes that are formed where some rivers come together and there's sort of mud bars that block up the water. Where I do think it's 2 or 3 miles wide in certain places up in Minnesota.
Why is it called the Big Muddy?
The big money, that phrase will be applied to different rivers as well. You hear it about the Missouri. Again, I think the Missouri and the Mississippi are sort of, if not the same, deeply intertwined siblings, but that is the presence of all of that mud, right? And you think of the Great Plains that the Missouri goes through, it's highly erodible territory. And so as the river is flowing, it's pulling that dirt off those plains, putting it in the river, comes down the Missouri River, comes into the Mississippi River. And so it is, there are stories from early eras when people were drinking the water out of the Mississippi River, right? To get a cup of that water, and you got to wait for a couple minutes to see all the mud settle out to the bottom, and that's still the case. And I remember getting out of the canoe down here in Louisiana, and just my knees sinking all the way down into the kind of mud that gets deposited along the banks. And so you understand the river, you have to think of it as not just water, but about that mud too. That has so much to do with the way it has behaved and what it does.
Boyce Upholt, is the Mississippi a recreational river in any way?
It depends on who you ask. I certainly think so. I that's my relationship to it, right? That is how I came to write this book. Was I just started canoeing out there more and more, and spending time with other people who like to canoe on it. As I said, my understanding of the sort of boating regulations is that every boat is supposed to defer to the smaller boats, right? So those of us in canoes actually have the ultimate right of way, and navigable rivers are public property, so they belong to everyone. So there's all these arguments to say that it is a recreational river. I think if you talk to pilots of towboats and tugboats, or if you talk to people in the navigation industry that is so economically important, they might discourage people from going out there for safety reasons, but I also think for self-serving reasons, right? It makes it harder for them to do their job if they have to navigate around idiots like me that are out there in canoes. So it's a tension, but I do think. I think the recreation is an important component. When I give talks, I often talk about the Mississippi River being essentially a forgotten river at this point, right? We know the name and we know about Mark Twain and all of it. Most of us think of it as being this economic thing where we know there are big boats out there, but people don't know what it looks like, don't know how beautiful it is, don't realize that it is an iconic landscape. It's as beautiful as Yellowstone or Yosemite in my mind. And I have come to think that because we don't know the river, because not enough people love the river, that has led to certain mistakes. It's easy we leave it in the hands of industries that are economically benefiting off it. It becomes an exploited river. And so I've seen a lot of push towards more recreation. I've met a lot of people that are building water trails on different stretches of the Mississippi and on the Missouri and on the Ohio. And I think it's really important work. I think I would love to see the average citizens of America to have some relationship with the Mississippi. And I think recreation is the best vehicle for doing that.
Mr. Upholt, 10 states border the Mississippi. Do 10 states have Mississippi River commissions?
There is that phrase, Mississippi River Commission, is sort of a one entity that is intertwined with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and oversees the regulation of this river. And so that's part of what I write about in the book, is sort of the tangled history of how we came to govern this river. Again, navigable rivers are federal property in essence; they're public property, and there was like a court decision back in the 200 years ago in 1824 where Louisiana had tried to sort of grant a monopoly to steamboat travel to one company, and then that was determined to be unconstitutional. They could, only the federal government could control that. And so that's why we have one Mississippi River Commission. Many of those states do have their own departments of various kinds that might have some impact on the river, wildlife departments. Here in Louisiana, we have a coastal protection and restoration authority that is working with the river, trying to think about ways to use it to build more marshland. And so that is good and bad, I think, right? That means there's lots of people paying attention to the river in these state departments, but it also makes governance complicated because anything we need to do needs to go through the federal level, but then also needs to work with all these different state level authorities. It's a quite, a river this big becomes a complicated thing in many ways.
And C-SPAN's Q&A podcast continues in a moment. So Minneapolis, St. Louis, Memphis, New Orleans, all major cities on the river, are they there because of the river?
In almost every case, yes. All those ones you named, at least, and most things along the river are there because of the river, right? Here in New Orleans, it's often called the impossible but inevitable city. It's a phrase from a geographer came up with a long time ago, kind of saying, New Orleans is famously a sinking city. It's a hurricane racked city. It's impossible, right? That it would never going to be the safest place to build a city. But when European settlers began to arrive here, it was also inevitable that something was going to be built near the mouth of the Mississippi River because that was going to be the way to control so much commerce coming through. And you can see the same in many of these other cities, right? St. Louis started as sort of this crossroads trading post in the 1700s as the French were kind of trying to control fur trade across a wide domain. Minneapolis was, for a long time, that was federal territory. It was sort of military owned and in relationship with indigenous people. And kind of as soon as that territory was going to be transferred to private hands, you saw this land rush of people trying to swoop in. There's a waterfall there that people saw as a potential source of water power. Memphis is actually a pretty late city in American history, but same thing. It sort of was seen as it's atop these bluffs. And so yeah, a lot of cities were formed here because so much commerce comes through. Interestingly, the smaller towns that were formed, like these sort of steamboat landings in rural Mississippi and Arkansas that were along the Mississippi River, those are mostly gone now because as technology changed, railroads, highways became more viable forms of transportation, and the river became a danger for these smaller settlements. And so, there are some ghost towns that you can go and you can see the name on the map, and there's nothing there anymore.
From your book, The Historical Record, the record that begins when Europeans show up with their journals and ledgers, takes up less than a second on the Mississippi River's historical clock. What are you telling us?
I mean, I think there are these, I've called the Mississippi River a forgotten river in this interview already, but there are sort of these certain stereotypes, archetypes, images that have been pressed into our mind about what the Mississippi River looks like, what it is, what it's possible there, right? So again, we think of the steamboats. We think of the towboats. We think of the river as this thing that we need to control and tame and build levees and dams around. We think of the Mississippi River as having a certain shape on the maps that we look at. It comes down through past Memphis and then past New Orleans, right? But all of these things are pretty recent. We've been talking before about how much the river changes, and actually here in Louisiana, where I live, the river would often jump through different paths. It would kind of punch through its own banks and then carve an entirely new route for as much as 100 miles or more. It's trying to do that right now. It's been, the Atchafalaya River is this other, it's called a distributary, right? It's an alternate route besides that the water can take to reach the Gulf of Mexico rather than following the main channel. And if left to its own devices, the Mississippi River would actually start shifting more and more water into the Atchafalaya River, and that would become the Mississippi. And so here in New Orleans, we'd be in this sort of much shallower, smaller river that would not be able to support the port we have. So we've built control structures. They're literally called control structures to make sure that doesn't happen, right? And I think it's just always really important to have the longer geological view, even the longer cultural view, and to realize that the names we've given to things, the places we've built cities, these are all in sort of nature's time quite temporary. And so we can and should, as someone who owns a home in New Orleans, I'm like, this is a precarious place. It's an impossible place, as I just said. And I'm all for keeping it because I own a home here. I love it. I love the culture. I love the place. But I think we should have some humility in that and realizing that it is sort of always going to be a losing fight, and that we have to recognize that the Mississippi River in this sort of longer window makes large big changes, and we may have to think about how we can accommodate those changes and sort of let the Mississippi River give it the chance to do some of the things it needs to do to be a healthy river.
Well,
And so that's the larger thing. The other thing I would add there is like in writing about the book, I did a lot of study of indigenous history on the river, and that's a reminder to me that sort of our notion of the Mississippi River as a thing to tame and control is 2 centuries old, and for thousands of years people have lived on this river and thought of it as something to fear, perhaps, but respect. And I think there's a lot to be learned from cultures that have managed to survive on this wily, crazy river for thousands of years.
well, you say the story begins 600 million years ago.
In many ways, yeah, I think that I can contradict myself in various ways. I sometimes call the Mississippi River 12,000 years old. Sometimes I call it 600 million years old, right? The geological origins of the river, there's sort of this rift underneath near Memphis in this town called New Madrid, caused this massive earthquake in the early 1800s, and is still active. So we could get a crazy earthquake at some point again. That formed when sort of Pangea, or like a supercontinent, was breaking up many hundreds of millions of years ago, and the presence of that sort of, as these continents drifted, it passed over some hot spots, and there were these different changes, right? And so that you have to understand all those changes. But the Mississippi River that we know today is, I would say, 12,000 years old, because the behaviors it has have to do with ice ages and the glacier. When the glaciers were there, it couldn't look like what it looked like. And so when it comes to nature, I think any sort of simple defining points are kind of useless, in the same way I was saying earlier. Lake Itasca is not the only headwaters. You can't really age a river. They're such dynamic objects that change all the time, or dynamic beings, I think I should say. And so, yes, it's both 600 million years old, it's tens of thousands of years old, but either of those are so much longer than sort of the historical record and the cultural perspective that we have on it today.
What was the impact of glaciers on the Mississippi?
So the glaciers came all the way south to about St. Louis. So again, I mentioned earlier, I think of the great river, the Mississippi, as being this watershed rather than one line of water. And so, you know, the Missouri, the Mississippi, or the Missouri, the upper Mississippi, the Ohio, those rivers just had to look different because so much of the terrain that they drain was covered in glaciers. But then down here in the south, right, the presence of glaciers also changes the water levels in the oceans. And so when you've got glaciers, they're holding a lot of water, so the water gets lower, things come up and down. And so there were periods where I am in New Orleans would be covered by water. Actually, the Gulf of Mexico kind of stretched up in an arc almost all the way to Illinois at certain times. And then when the glaciers were melting, there was so much water running through the Mississippi. So it actually was not even one river. It was just lots of braided rivers kind of pouring together. And then as we sort of settled into the kind of climate we've known of late, it's changing as again, but sort of the climate we've been familiar with as human beings for the past 10,000 years, that was when the Mississippi River settled into behaviors that are familiar to us today in terms of the winding, meandering Mississippi, the flood behaviors that we've been seeing.
Boyce Upholt, let's just jump ahead for a second here. But if man had not manipulated the Mississippi River in any way, shape, or form, in your view, would your house in New Orleans exist?
Not in its form right here. Like I'm in lucky because I am 2 blocks from the Mississippi River in this house, and the Mississippi is actually strangely down here. It's the highest ground, right? It's a valley that's been built by the river, and so it's dumped out its dirt, and it sort of has a natural levee. And so I'm pretty high here, but still, my house is maybe the foundation puts it 2 feet off the ground. I think that people have always lived in this delta down here. It was called Wabancha by the Choctaw, the land of many languages, essentially, right? This was a gathering place on the continent because so many cultures would cross paths here. And so I think houses probably would exist here, maybe on stilts, or they'd be places that are occupied seasonally. People come and go. But New Orleans as a city certainly would not exist. The kind of urban living that we have is not particularly viable with the river in its natural regime, because this would be a giant swamp that would be covered in water half the year or more.
What about the rest of the river? Would it look as it does?
No, absolutely not. I mean, again, the floodplain on the lower Mississippi River is as much as 90 miles wide up, and that's up in Mississippi and Arkansas, so hundreds of river miles upstream of here, right? It was this vast inland sea where so Hernando de Soto was the first it has the first written records we have of the Mississippi River, and he writes about on his expedition in the 1530s, 1540s, sort of overwintering in an indigenous town that was just on the edge of the floodplain, and he watches this water come up, and he would have seen what was essentially an inland sea that stretched for 90 miles, and maybe it was only feet or inches deep in places of that, but to cross from Arkansas to Mississippi, it'd be 90 miles of water, and so that makes settlement really difficult. And that actually, right, there wasn't a whole lot of settlement in Mississippi and Arkansas along the Mississippi River for several hundred years because it was so hard to figure out how to tame these kinds of floods. It was always looked at as this landscape that had so much promise for farming because these river carried soils were so rich in organic fertilizers. But just really hard to tame that flooding. And so, yeah, if we hadn't touched it, we'd have this vast wetland in the middle of the country, which I think would be fascinating and maybe really valuable in its own way. The river would also take a different shape, right? Maybe it would be flowing down the Atchafalaya at this point. It's sort of also hard today to disentangle what is natural, what is human caused. I said earlier that the river's trying to go down the Atchafalaya, but that may be because of our own meddling. We did like cut off some of these big bends and we've built levees, and that's changed the hydrologic and the hydrogeologic, the flow of water and mud both in ways that maybe encouraged the Atchafalaya to become a bigger river. So besides knowing that the Mississippi would be this vast swampy valley, it's hard to even predict quite what shape it would have today had we not built all the engineering that we built.
And what is that word you're using? The Chapalaya?
Atchafalaya River, yes. So that is it's sort of Cajun country. It is the distributary that travels through Louisiana to the west of New Orleans, so Lafayette, Louisiana, and a bunch of small towns. It is this giant swamp. It's also now an engineered floodway for the Mississippi River. So when we get bad floods, we open up some gates and just tons of water gets dumped down the Atchafalaya River so that it's not going to come and hit New Orleans.
Okay, you use some words throughout your book. Watershed. What does that mean?
So the watershed is sort of I don't know, think about it as the territory of the river. It is if rain falls in the Mississippi's watershed, that then the water is going to flow into the Mississippi and come down here past New Orleans or go down the Atchafalaya River that I just mentioned. So it's sort of if you drew a boundary all along the Mississippi and said, this is all of the territory that belongs to the river. That's the watershed.
So 32 states, rainfall in 32 states impacts the Mississippi River.
Yeah, I mean, one funny note is when I was doing the fact checking for the book, it was actually hard to get that number quite right. It appears that maybe 1 acre of South Carolina is included in the watershed, probably just because of a surveyor's error where they were trying to draw it along the edge of it. So different sources have different numbers is one thing I realized. And so it goes back to the wideliness of rivers. But yes, it's this huge expanse of the U.S.
Alluvial, that appears in your book quite often.
Yes, so alluvial is essentially, think of it as river built, right? So the alluvial valley is the valley along the lower Mississippi River. I mentioned earlier that the Gulf of Mexico used to be sort of this horn shape, right? It like reached up in this narrow bay up towards Memphis and beyond. And then the river, as the rivers, the Missouri, the Ohio, the Mississippi, kind of flowed down the continent towards that trough, they carried mud, and that mud is what filled up that valley. And so that makes it this alluvial valley because all of that territory along the river was actually built by the river itself.
Floodplain.
Floodplain is, the territory along the river that in a high water year is liable to be covered in water, right? And so that there's a line in the book of like the story of a river is always should be the story of a floodplain because I think of it as part of the river. It's part of the health of the ecosystem, right? Like baby fish need to grow up in a floodplain. It's a safer space. But we in the modern era have often looked at the floodplain as not a part of the river and tried to separate it out and build things like New Orleans or like the Mississippi Delta, the Cotton Kingdom in Mississippi.
Levee.
So levee is, I mean, there's two definitions here, right? Because there are natural levees, which are sort of the river-built embankments just along the river. So again, in the alluvial valley, this river-built valley, most of the mud gets dumped. When you get a flood, it kind of flows over the banks, and then the mud starts to get dumped right next to the river, and then gets less and less mud. And so the natural levee is this embankment that the river builds along its own edges. And then we built our own levees to sort of give ourselves more protection. The natural levee, most of the year, that will keep the water in the banks, but of course, it will get higher than that from time to time. We've built earthen embankments, usually in certain places there's concrete on them, but the levee is basically a wall that we've built that stretches for thousands of miles along the Mississippi River to make sure that we can kind of have modern territory in the floodplain.
Boyce Upholt, prior to the arrival of Europeans, how important was the river to the natives?
It's a really good question. I mean, I will note that I am working on conjecture. I looked at a lot of archaeology. I tried to look at oral history and the stories passed down by contemporary indigenous people who are descended from people who lived along the river. And so it's a patchwork of guesswork and looking at and what's in that. But it seems to me that the river was incredibly important. The one of the things that marks that is sort of these earthworks, as I call them in the book, borrowing a phrase from an indigenous scholar, often called Indian mounds. But that word mound is sort of dismissive to me. The largest set of these earthworks is in across the river from St. Louis, so in Illinois. It's called Cahokia. So there's hundreds of mounds. The largest one is more than 100 feet tall. It was essentially a city 1,000 years ago with 20, 30,000 people living in that territory, which I don't think people associate urban living with indigenous people. But Cahokia is one of many different earthwork sites. Many others are just as epic in their own way. There's a site called Poverty Point here in Louisiana that is almost 4,000 years old and seems to me to be sort of one of the first cosmopolitan gathering places on the continent. It's disputed what it was there for. I tend to believe that it was sort of never fully occupied, but cultures from across the watershed would come together there for some kind of celebration. And so these things, I don't know, if you read them, if you understand their history, if you understand their stories, they seem to be telling a story about the sacredness of the wetlands on the river and the way the river connects water and sky and connects different territories. And so the fact that these earthworks were built again and again over thousands of years in ways that always point back towards this great watershed says something about the sacred importance of the river. One of the things that I found most compelling is a figure called Grandmother. That's what often archaeologists call her, but it's this spiritual figure that appears in many different indigenous cultures. As far away as the Dakotas, there are stories told about Grandmother, about how Grandmother taught people how to grow crops. And Grandmother is associated in particular with the mouth of the Mississippi River, right? This territory that I'm down here in Louisiana. She lives on an island. She sort of was rebirthed by getting into these waters down here. And so I think people look at this chaotic landscape and saw it as a deeply life-giving place because it is. It is such a rich ecology that there's a whole lot of food here. Like farming almost wasn't necessary in this territory because you could be a hunter-gatherer here and live a pretty a sedentary life. Like you go hunt and then lounge for the rest of the day. There was just so much food around if that's the way you wanted to do things.
Father Marquette, Louis Joliet, Rene Robert de La Salle, Hernando de Soto, all make appearances in your book. What was the impact of Europeans in the Mississippi River area?
Yeah, for a while, not much, right? I mean, yes, that may be too dismissive, but we were not particularly present for a long time, right? Hernando de Soto came through in the mid 16th century. It took more than 100 years before the French returned. And so clearly this was a distant territory. It wasn't immediately valued. De Soto's soldiers didn't go home and convince their compatriots of like, we got to rush back and go to that big muddy landscape. So that richness that I just mentioned that indigenous people seem so aware of was not the kind of richness that early Europeans were seeking, right? Hernando de Soto wanted to find gold, and you don't find gold in this muddy landscape. That said, I think that even before Europeans were a physical presence on the Mississippi River, their presence was felt, right? That this was in part potentially diseases that Hernando de Soto and his men brought to North America that people along the river did not have experience with. So there's this huge population decline between de Soto's expedition and the arrival of the French, again, more than a century later. The presence of, right, there were people settling on the eastern seaboard. British, French were disputing that territory. And they were constantly kind of sending people to try and find the edges of the watershed. That was leading to certain slave raiding groups that were coming in and sort of enslaving indigenous people. And so there was this precipitous population decline on the Mississippi River even before Europeans got here in a way that's really interesting and I think colors our vision of the river today. If you go and look at LaSalle's description of the Mississippi River, we think of that as being like, oh, here's the record of an early explorer. This must be the Mississippi River in its quote natural state. But actually, it's the description of the Mississippi River after an apocalypse had swept through. And so the forests were kind of overgrown because the people who took care of the forests weren't there to clear them anymore. The villages were empty. And so we have this maybe false picture of like how wild and empty the Mississippi River used to be. It used to be one of the more busy and cosmopolitan places on the continent.
Did the 1803 Louisiana Purchase include the Mississippi River?
Yeah, so it's centered around that river, right? So Jefferson, his goal was initially to have his negotiators just get New Orleans so that there could be control that is the city where it was so important, right? People were traveling down the river, and technically the Spanish were not allowing Americans to sort of unload their goods in New Orleans, and that was a big obstacle to U.S. commerce. And he was surprised, but there were all these sort of imperial machinations that meant that Spain had given it to France, and France couldn't use it anymore. And so suddenly Jefferson found himself on the cheap acquiring the Mississippi territory, this whole watershed. I note in the book that what he was acquiring was less the watershed and more the right to negotiate with the people on the watershed to take it from them, right? Because it was still largely indigenous occupied out to the west along the Missouri River and other places. But that to me is a fundamental turning point for the United States of America and for the river itself, because it's the first moment when one imperial power kind of claimed all of this watershed is ours alone. And that opened the door for the kinds of large-scale engineering changes that would come starting just a couple decades later.
And from your book, The Mississippi River's American Era began on October 27th, 1815. That's very specific.
It is very specific, yes. Helpful for the narrative to be able to put the pin in the ground in one place. But that was a really interesting moment where two different teams of surveyors were working to sort of find what is called an initial point. So the initial point is like America in that era, Jefferson was part of this, had this obsession with surveying the landscape. It's like we need to understand this giant place that we now have that we know very little about, and we need to map it and put it on this grid. And it is a very, in a way, imperialistic way of thinking of like, let's abstract this and have God's eye view and see if we can understand the landscape from up here. And so the initial point was sort of the organizing point around which future surveys would be demarcated, right? It's sort of like if you remember in algebra class, there's the origin point on a coordinate plane, that 0, 0 point in the middle of those two crossed axes. That's what I think of the initial point as a point of reference for a bunch of other surveys. And it was just somewhat arbitrary. It was sort of like one team's going to leave from this river, one team's going to leave from this river, and wherever your paths cross, that's the initial point of all surveys west of the Mississippi River. And it wound up being just like in a cypress swamp in the middle of rural Arkansas, in this really piece of territory that really no one wanted for hundreds of years later, which to me is indicative of a certain American way of sort of like imposing something on the landscape instead of thinking about what the landscape is itself. It's like we want to make this perfect gridded landscape here, and yet what is there is a really hard to tame swamp.
And C-SPAN's Q&A podcast continues in a moment. You mentioned the Army Corps of Engineers and their management of the river. When did that begin?
1824 is really the origin date for their management of the river. So the Army Corps of Engineers precedes that. In some ways, they go all the way back to the American Revolution, when sort of the hard scrabble pioneer revolutionaries weren't a whole lot of highly trained engineers in the colonies, right? And so the Revolutionary Army in Washington was thinking, we need to build bridges, we need to build forts. And so they wound up bringing a lot of French engineers over as allies that had better academies over there. And so Thomas Jefferson in the early 1800s kind of said, well, we don't want to get stuck that way again. We better have our own training academy. And so he founded West Point in New York, and sort of the Army Corps and West Point were the same thing initially. And then they started to change and morph and grow in these different entities. But at first it was just this elite corps of military officials being trained in mathematics and trigonometry and things like that. But I mentioned earlier a court decision where the Supreme Court said, only the federal government has control over interstate commerce. Louisiana, you can't say this one steamboat company's in charge. And when that happened, it was sort of like, well, that means we probably should have some federal people making some maps and thinking about, can we make this a better river for these steamboats? And when the government cast its eyes around for who might be qualified to do that, they said, "Oh, we got these engineers. They seem like good people for mapping." And so in 1824, this first batch of funding went out to survey the river, and pretty quickly after that, kind of install very small pieces of engineering at first to try and keep the Ohio River in particular a little bit deeper for the boats that were traveling down it.
So when I think of the Mississippi and the Civil War, I think of Vicksburg. How important was the Mississippi during the Civil War?
Quite important. And interestingly, this is the when I was trying to keep a book about the whole history of the Mississippi River and what we've done to it to just 300 pages, I had to cut some things out. And so the Civil War does not figure hugely in my book, in part because I'm interested in sort of what we've done to the river, and the war was this kind of interregnum in which we were so busy fighting each other that we did not have the capacity to do a whole lot of engineering. But in the same way that early European empires looked at the Mississippi River as we got to control that mouth of that river because then we're going to control commerce across the watershed. That was the same thought process during the Civil War, right? And the Union victory in the Civil War, I think, has a lot to do with the fact of like securing control of the river, choking out the ability of the Confederate Army to move goods along that river. It's sort of the Confederacy became encircled by Union control, and so it's that same old logic. In that era, the Mississippi remained this really important highway for commerce, for traffic, for moving goods, and controlling it was going to change the fate of that conflict.
Boyce Upholt, there are 29 dams on the Mississippi River. When did they start to appear?
Ooh, the earliest of those dams. Wow, there's some smaller dams that I'm not sure are in that 29 figure that were built near the headwaters in the late 1880s. These sort of small experiments. And these aren't what people think of when they picture Mississippi River dams. These are sort of holding back water in little lakes along the river so that water could be released slowly into St. Paul because St. Paul was considered the head of navigation. And so the 1880s was this big rush of engineering on a lot of different pieces of the watershed. And those are the very first dams built. But the dams that we think of today, those big sort of bracings that span the river from between St. Paul or between Minneapolis and St. Louis. Those were built mostly in the 1930s. There were a couple earlier dams along very treacherous stretches of the river in the early 1900s. And before all those dams were built, it was sort of piloted on the Ohio River. So the first dams on the Ohio, again, were the 1880s. So it was this long multi-decade project of putting dams in different pieces of the Mississippi River, but those upper Mississippi dams were really 1930s, part of the New Deal, this rush of like, we need to build stuff, we need jobs, we need to create a modern country in the shadow of the Great Depression.
Are there dams on the lower Mississippi as well?
There are no dams on the lower Mississippi River, no. It is such a large river that for the most part, right, the point of these dams on the Ohio, on the upper Mississippi, are largely to take a shallow river and ensure that throughout the navigable season, when there's not ice on the water, we can keep it deep enough for these big boats. And congressionally, it's authorized most of the river. It's basically a 9-foot channel, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. The lower Mississippi River is almost always 9 feet deep. Lately, there have been some quite low water years because of drought across the watershed where some of the boats are running into trouble. But in general, it was sort of too big a river to bother with dams down here.
So do you have to have special boats for the Mississippi, specially designed boats?
I mean, you and I don't, right? Any canoe could be thrown in there, and a fishing boat, right? You're fine on certain stretches. But because, I mean, the steamboat that we picture as sort of the archetypal Mississippi River object was designed for the Mississippi watershed, right? For the Ohio and the upper Mississippi in particular, the demands of these shallow rivers and this just desire in the frontier era, this was the way to move things. And so people were like, we got to figure out a way to move them. So really shallow bottom barges, you see these boats pushing these shallow bottom barges, that all developed because of the constraints of the Mississippi River. And there was an early era in the early 1800s when the United States was not really a technological force, and yet engineers were coming all over the world to look at these boats because they had become this thing that was changing the country, this sudden super technology.
So 1912, 1927, what happened and what happened afterwards?
Yeah, so 1927 in particular is sort of the year of flood of record on the lower Mississippi River. So every stretch of the Mississippi has different floods. Right up in St. Louis, people think a lot about 1993, but the 1927 flood, which we're coming up on the 100th year anniversary, not too far away, and there's going to be a lot of celebrations and reflections down here in the South about that. It was sort of like the Hurricane Katrina of its era, to think of another thing that is coming up on an anniversary, right? It was devastating all across the South and rural Mississippi and rural Arkansas. Hundreds of thousands of people were out of their homes. There were these refugee camps. It, helped usher Herbert Hoover into power. And so just this super culture and river changing event down here in the South. Often it's depicted as this turning point in the Mississippi River where the way we engineered the river suddenly changed because we had only been building levees before that. And after the 1927 flood, it was sort of like, well, those levees caused this flood. And so we need more complex forms of engineering. I tend to think of it a little bit differently. Again, I mentioned earlier this long geological view, and if you think in that way, it feels less like a change and more like an intensification, where we had been trying, as America, we had been trying for 100 years before the 1927 flood to control the Mississippi River, and that flood was this big failure. And we said, rather than saying we can't do it, we sort of doubled down on our efforts to do it and built an even more machine-like river that has all these different outlets and gates and control structures. And so it sort of was the birth of the modern Mississippi River that we've known for the past 100 years. That, let's knock on wood that there is no disaster quite so bad as the 1927 flood again. But I do think as we're coming up on 100 years later, we're seeing some mistakes in what we built, and that it would be foolish for us to think we are now in control of the Mississippi River. It seems to still be doing what it wants in ways that resist what we would like it to be doing.
Well, you write that the Flood Control Act of 1928, signed by Calvin Coolidge, was the largest public works project in the history of the United States, bigger than the Panama Canal.
Absolutely, right. Yeah. So it led to, thousands of miles of levee building along the river. The levee was already there, but now had to double in height. And then all of these different control structures that I mentioned. And so it is, in some ways you could think about it, like it was soon followed by even larger public works projects, right? The New Deal was coming. But this was just before the Great Depression, right? It in some ways signals the shifting direction of the country as we think about what is the federal government's responsibility in terms of engineering and building a modern society.
Boyce Upholt, how did the petrochemical industry spring up around Baton Rouge, between Baton Rouge and New Orleans along the Mississippi? Why there? And I'm
reasons.
Calling it petrochemical. I don't know if that's the correct term or not, but
Yeah, I mean, fossil fuel industry, petrochemical. We call it petrochemical now in that more and more often, right? It's no longer just an oil industry, but the things that the materials that are being pulled out of the Gulf of Mexico and other places are now rendered into all kinds of chemicals, right? They're broken down into feedstocks and turned back into chemicals. And so there's this cluster of more than 200 industrial facilities between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, which causes a lot of pollution problems. It causes a lot of environmental justice problems because there are historically African American neighborhoods along the river clustered in there. But as to why it's there, I mean, it's there because of the river and it's there because of the engineering, right? We just talked about the Mississippi Rivers and Tributaries Project, this epic flood control effort. And then interesting, like there used to be all kinds of sugar production along the river. There still is sugar production, but that economy started to decline right around when all this flood control infrastructure was built. And so all of a sudden there are these large parcels that used to be sugar plantations that are no longer being devoted to sugar. And so big real estate with federal flood protection at the same time that the oil industry is starting to emerge and starting to need places to refine the products they're building. And so those companies said, great, here, like the federal government has already paid for flood protection. We have easy access to transporting these goods all across the world. So they swooped in and started building more and more plants there. And then it becomes, I think, a feedback loop of there's some really beautiful places along that stretch of river that still feel rural and idyllic. But I think in the nation's mind, it is now this sort of dystopian industrial hellscape even. And that makes it easier and easier to bring more of those facilities in. And so there's continued efforts to build more heavily polluting petrochemical facilities in that geology.
When it comes to pollution, is the entire Mississippi, would you consider it polluted?
No, I mean, here in New Orleans, we get our drinking water out of the Mississippi River, and we're at the very bottom of the watershed where all these things come from. And we heavily clean it, and then I clean it again before I drink it in my house to pull out even more things. But I note in the book that when I do these long canoe trips, we bring our own water. We try and have clean water. But if we run out of that water for a weekend and we can't get some resupply, we will boil that water for a while and make our coffee out of it. I will swim in it most places. Again, less likely to do so here in Louisiana, where we're at the bottom of all those facilities I just talked about. But the Clean Water Act in the 1970s was really transformational. There were moments in our nation's history when the Mississippi really was a toxic river, and it's not anymore. I mean, there are problems. There are pharmaceuticals. There are fertilizers that are not controlled by the Clean Water Act. But it is a river that if you fall on it, you're not going to sort of grow a third limb. You can go out there and swim and recreate and be just fine.
What about agricultural runoff? Is that an issue?
Yeah, so the fertilizers I just mentioned, they are a big issue, right? And they're like the agricultural industry calls these nutrients, which sounds friendlier, right? Because nutrients, right? It's something that helps plants grow. And in general, in the river itself, I'm not that worried about the nutrients in the flow, but what happens is when those nutrients arrive in a blackwater lake or when they arrive in the Gulf of Mexico, they become nutrients for algae. And then you get these algal blooms, and those can lead to toxic chemicals coming off those algae. And so there's a site called the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico where so many of this runoff is collected, and it's really killed off a lot of sea life. And that's been a really hard thing to manage because of, we mentioned earlier, sort of the interstate nature of this. It's been hard for anyone to come up with a plan that can stop all this from happening from all of the different states that send their agricultural runoff into the river.
Boyce Upholt, you write also about something we don't probably think about on a daily basis, Asian carp.
I do, yes. I mean, if you're on the Mississippi River, you might think about them on a daily basis because they are very heavily infested in certain stretches. They leap out of the water. It's sort of a fear response and knock boaters unconscious, right? So if they hear the groan of a motorboat, and that gets them jumping, and they jump right into people's faces as they're water skiing. And so that is not a really, we haven't found a great way to control it. It's a fight that we're fighting, and the biggest engineering efforts around it is mostly to close off connectors between different things, right? So there's a canal from Chicago into Lake Michigan, which interconnects the Great Lakes and the Mississippi watershed. And that is an electrified canal now to make sure that Asian carp aren't going to go further and invade the Great Lakes. And there's been some efforts around making sure they don't get past some of the northernmost locks and dams on the upper Mississippi River to reach those fragile lakes near Lake Itasca. So it is a fight that we'll be fighting and thinking about for a while.
What was the role of the Mississippi River in the 2006 Katrina hurricane flood?
It's a good question. I mean, like that was a question that I had to ask when I was starting this book. And when I was first outlining things, I was like, surely I will talk about Katrina in this book. And I don't, in part because we hear a lot about the levee failures that happened 20 years ago this week, as we're talking, right? We're coming up on the anniversary. But the levees that failed during Katrina, New Orleans is protected by two different interconnected levee systems. We have a river levee system along the Mississippi River, and then we have a hurricane protection system because so much of the land is below water. We're bordered by Lake Pontchartrain to the north, which is essentially just an inlet of the Gulf of Mexico. So we have to keep water out on all edges. And it was actually the levees along Lake Pontchartrain and along certain canals that connect to Lake Pontchartrain that failed, and they failed because of sort of the storm surge of river water pushing in through up into the Gulf of Mexico, through the lake, through those canals. And so the river levees have done their job for hundreds of years, at least here in New Orleans. And I was recently listening to an interview with historian Andrew Horowitz, who's written a great book about Katrina. And he made a point that really stuck with me is there's a lesson to be learned there, right? It's like the levees they've done certain problematic things to the river ecology, but the fact that they are these big piles of earth. And the hurricane protection levees are often concrete, and actually concrete may sound stronger, but they're more fragile. And so it leads us to think about sort of what levels of protection are we building where and why is an important thing raised by that distinction.
Is The Great River your first book?
The Great River is my first book, yes.
And what did you do right and what didn't you do right in writing it?
Oh, good question. I mean, the book's kind of structured into three sections. And so the first two are like ancient history and then American history. And the end of the book is about what I think of as the journalism section. It is me wandering the country, wandering the watershed, looking at sort of conflicts and issues that have arisen because of all we've done and the way we've come to see the river. And that section, it was twice as long in my first draft, right? I sort of wrote everything I could find, and my editor said, well, this is a collection of 7 magazine stories, not a piece of a book. And so that was the biggest piece of work, was trying to trim that down into something containable. So that's what I did wrong. In terms of what I did right, I don't know. I'll leave that to the readers, I guess. But I don't know. The things I'm most proud of. I mean, I guess the hard thing in a book like this is there's no central character, right? Because I go back thousands of years, and so the only central character is the river itself. And hopefully it succeeded, but it certainly was a lot of fun for me to go back and look at archaeology and geology and old travel memoirs and find every way I could find of documenting what the river was in the past, so I could keep it alive in the reader's eyes throughout all of those eras as a living, breathing entity that we live alongside.
Connecticut native and New Orleans resident Boyce Upholt is the author of this book, The Great River, The Making and Unmaking of the Mississippi. We appreciate your spending a little time with us here on C-SPAN.
Thanks so much, Peter. It's an honor to be here.
Well, thanks for being with us on the Q&A podcast. Next week, our guest is Stuart McLaurin. Stuart is president of the White House Historical Association, and he's the author of a new book of facts and figures and hidden histories about the White House, The People's House Miscellany.